What happens when humanity's greatest weakness becomes their most terrifying strength? When the very thing that makes us fragile, our need for rest, our mortal limitations, turns out to be the key to conquering the stars. Captain Jake Morrison thought he was just another prisoner of war, captured during humanity's first disastrous encounter with the Zephyrian Empire. He expected torture, interrogation, maybe a quick death. What he didn't expect was to become the personal entertainment of Empress Vexthera, a being whose species never sleeps, never tires, and has conquered 1,000 worlds through sheer relentless persistence. But the Empress made one critical error in her assessment of human nature. She assumed that because humans need rest, they are weak. She never considered that maybe, just maybe, humans have learned to fight fatigue itself, and in doing so, have become something far more dangerous than any apex predator the galaxy has ever seen. In a universe where stamina means survival and endurance equals empire, one exhausted human is about to teach an alien queen that sometimes the greatest victories come not from never falling down, but from always getting back up. This is the story of how humanity's most basic biological need became their weapon of mass liberation. Captain Jake Morrison's eyes snapped open to the harsh glare of alien lighting. His head, pounding like a construction site, had taken up residence in his skull. The last thing he remembered was the Zephyrian dreadnought's energy beam cutting through his fighter's shields like tissue paper, the sickening lurch as his craft spiraled out of control, and then nothing. Now he found himself in what could only be described as the galaxy's most uncomfortable chair, restraints made of some crystalline material holding his arms and legs in place. The chamber around him was vast and intimidating, with walls that seemed to pulse with a bioluminescent purple light. Strange geometric patterns covered every surface, creating an optical illusion that made his already aching head throb worse. The air tasted metallic, with an underlying sweetness that made his stomach churn. Everything about this place screamed alien power and sophistication, designed to make prisoners feel small and helpless. Jake tested the restraints carefully, applying pressure at different angles. The crystalline bonds didn't budge, but they weren't cutting into his skin either. Professional captors, then. They wanted him alive and relatively undamaged, which could be good or very, very bad depending on their intentions. His military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, look for weaknesses, prepare for escape opportunities. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, followed by the whisper-quiet sound of a door opening. Jake forced himself to remain calm as footsteps approached, though his pulse quickened when he caught sight of his captor. The being that entered was unlike anything in the xenobiology briefings he'd studied. She stood nearly 8 feet tall, with an elegant, elongated form that moved with predatory grace. Her skin was a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and intricate silver markings traced patterns across her arms and face like living tattoos. But it was her eyes that captured Jake's attention and held it. They were large, multifaceted like an insect's, but with an intelligence that was unmistakably sapient and calculating. When she looked at him, Jake felt like a specimen under a microscope, every detail of his existence being cataloged and analyzed. Her presence filled the room with an aura of absolute authority that made the air itself seem heavier. Human, she spoke, and her voice was like music played on crystal instruments, beautiful, but somehow wrong in frequencies that human ears weren't designed to process comfortably. I am Empress Vexthera of the Zephyrian Empire. You have the distinction of being the first of your species to survive capture by my forces. Jake decided that silence was his best option for now. Let her do the talking and reveal her intentions. Information was power, and he needed every advantage he could get in this situation. The Empress seemed to approve of his caution, a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth suggesting amusement. Your silence speaks of training and discipline. Good. I have little patience for the screaming and pleading that lesser species typically provide. She began to circle his chair with that same predatory grace, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. Do you know why you're here, human? Why I personally ordered your capture rather than simply destroying your pathetic vessel along with the rest of your fleet? When Jake still didn't respond, She stopped directly in front of him, leaning down until her face was inches from his. This close, he could see that her skin wasn't actually solid blue, but covered in microscopic scales that shifted color slightly as they caught the light. Her breath smelled like ozone and something floral he couldn't identify. "Your species fascinates me," she continued, straightening to her full height. "In all my centuries of conquest, in all the thousands of worlds that have fallen before the might of my empire, I have never encountered a species quite like yours. You are weak, fragile, short-lived creatures who somehow managed to develop faster-than-light travel and energy weapons. It defies all logical progression of evolutionary development." Jake finally spoke, his voice hoarse but steady. "Maybe you just haven't been paying attention to the right things." The Empress laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "Ah, he speaks, and with such confidence for one in your position. Tell me, human, what is your designation, your rank, and function in your military hierarchy?" "Captain Jake Morrison, United Earth Defense Force, service number 779 Alpha Delta 6621. According to the Galactic Warfare Convention, I'm entitled to... The Galactic Warfare Convention applies only to civilized species recognized by the Council of Worlds," Vextra interrupted smoothly. "Your species has not achieved such recognition, nor do I recognize any authority beyond my own within my territory. You exist here at my pleasure, nothing more." The casual dismissal of his rights should have been terrifying, but Jake found himself oddly reassured instead. Tyrants who had to point out their absolute power usually weren't as secure in it as they pretended. It was a weakness he might be able to exploit eventually. "However," the Empress continued, "I am not without curiosity about your kind. Your fleet fought with a tenacity that impressed my admirals, even as it was systematically destroyed. You threw your ships at our forces with what can only be described as suicidal determination, achieving casualties against us that our battle computers calculated as statistically impossible given the disparity in our technological capabilities." She activated some kind of holographic display with a gesture, showing a three-dimensional recreation of the battle. Jake watched grimly as tiny representations of human ships engaged the massive Zephyrian vessels, their weapons barely scratching the alien hulls, while return fire vaporized them instantly. It was like watching ants attack elephants if the ants had energy cannons and the elephants were made of nearly indestructible materials. "Observe here," Vexter pointed to one section of the display, where a damaged human destroyer continued firing even as its hull breached and atmosphere vented into space. "Your ship was crippled, life support failing, yet it maintained combat operations for another 4 minutes and 17 seconds. My analysts calculate that the crew should have been unconscious from oxygen deprivation within 90 seconds. Jake remembered that ship, the UES Intrepid, under Captain Sarachun. Good people, all of them. They'd known they were dying and kept fighting anyway because that's what humans did. They didn't quit, even when quitting was the logical choice. Or this engagement. The Empress continued, highlighting another section where human fighters swarmed a Zephyrian cruiser like angry wasps. Your pilots maintained attack formations while pulling gravitational forces that should have rendered them unconscious. My medical staff estimates that your species should be physically incapable of surviving the acceleration stress involved in such maneuvers. We call it pulling G's, Jake said quietly, and humans have been doing impossible things since before we left our home world. It's kind of our specialty." The Empress deactivated the display and fixed those unsettling, multifaceted eyes on him again. "Which brings me to my purpose in keeping you alive, Captain Morrison. You see, my species, the Zephyrians, are evolutionarily perfect. We do not tire. We do not require rest. We do not succumb to fatigue or exhaustion. We are capable of sustained physical and mental activity indefinitely. It is this trait that has allowed us to conquer most of this galaxy through sheer persistence and endurance." She began pacing again, her movements becoming more animated as she spoke. "We simply outlast our enemies. While they exhaust themselves in futile resistance, we maintain constant pressure until they collapse from their own limitations. It is an elegant strategy that has proven universally effective. Until now." Jake was beginning to understand where this was going, and he didn't like it one bit. Your species appears to possess the impossible ability to function beyond your physical limitations, Vexthera continued, to push through exhaustion and pain in ways that violate biological law. I have decided that you will demonstrate this capability for me personally. You will show me exactly how humans accomplish these impossible feats of endurance. The restraint around Jake's arms and legs dissolved with a soft chiming sound, allowing him to stand for the first time since regaining consciousness. His legs felt shaky, whether from whatever drug they'd used to keep him unconscious or from the stress of the situation. He wasn't sure. The Empress gestured toward a doorway that hadn't been there moments before. Come, Captain. We begin immediately. I prepared a series of tests designed to push your species' endurance capabilities to their absolute limits. You will perform these tests until I'm satisfied that I understand the mechanisms behind human persistence. Jake stood slowly, working feeling back into his arms. And if I refuse? The Empress smiled, showing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. Then, I will move on to testing the other human prisoners. Yes, Captain, you are not the only survivor. Several of your comrades are currently enjoying the hospitality of my detention facilities. Their participation in my experiments depends entirely on your cooperation. It wasn't really a choice at all. Jake nodded grimly and followed the Empress toward the doorway. As they walked, she continued speaking, her voice taking on an almost academic tone that somehow made her words more chilling. The first test is relatively simple, a test of basic human endurance capabilities. You will run until you collapse from exhaustion, at which point my medical staff will revive you and we will begin again. We will repeat this process until I have sufficient data on human recovery rates and adaptation mechanisms. The doorway led to a corridor that seemed to stretch on forever in both directions, lit by the same pulsing bioluminescent panels as the interrogation chamber. Jake's boots echoed on the metallic floor as they walked, the only sound besides the Empress's continuing monologue. Subsequent tests will involve increasingly complex scenarios designed to simulate combat stress, sleep deprivation, and sustained physical trauma. I am particularly interested in understanding how your species maintains cognitive function under extreme duress. My researchers theorize that humans possess some form of biochemical override system that allows consciousness to persist despite physiological shutdown. They passed several doorways, each sealed with the same crystalline material that had formed his restraints. Behind some of them, Jake thought he could hear sounds, voices, or movement that suggested other prisoners. How many humans had survived the battle? How many of his people were trapped in this alien hell? The testing facility is quite comprehensive, Vexthera said, apparently noticing his attention to the doors they passed. I have spared no expense in creating an environment that will allow for thorough investigation of human capabilities. Some of the tests may seem harsh by your species standards, but I assure you they are necessary for proper scientific inquiry. They reached another junction in the corridor system, and the Empress led him down a different passage. This one was wider, with a higher ceiling that disappeared into shadow above them. The walls here were covered in what looked like monitoring equipment, banks of displays, and sensor arrays that Jake didn't recognize, but that were obviously sophisticated technology. Tell me, Captain, the Empress said as they walked, what do you know of exhaustion? Not merely being tired, but true physical and mental breakdown from sustained effort. Has your species developed methods for transcending such limitations? Jake considered his answer carefully. Information was a weapon that could cut both ways. Every human knows exhaustion. We live with it every day. The difference is we don't let it stop us from doing what needs to be done. Fascinating. And how do you accomplish this? What mental techniques or technological aids does your species employ to overcome biological imperatives? Coffee, mostly, Jake said with deliberate flippancy and stubbornness. The Empress stopped walking and turned to regard him with those unsettling compound eyes. For a moment, Jake wondered if he'd pushed too far with the humor, but then she laughed again, that same wind chime sound. Your species' tendency toward humor in dire circumstances is another curious trait I intend to investigate. Psychological deflection mechanisms, perhaps, or some form of stress response that maintains mental flexibility under pressure. We shall see how long the humor persists under proper testing conditions. They reached a massive door that opened at the Empress's approach, revealing what Jake could only describe as a nightmare gymnasium. The space beyond was enormous, filled with equipment and obstacles that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd studied human physiology just enough to know exactly how to break it. Treadmills that extended into the distance, obstacle courses that seemed to defy physics, and machines whose purpose Jake couldn't even guess at, but that radiated malevolent intent. "Welcome to Laboratory 7, Vextera announced with obvious pride. "Here we will unlock the secrets of human endurance and discover exactly what it takes to break a member of your species. I do hope you've gotten sufficient rest during your unconscious period, Captain Morrison." Jake looked around the testing facility and felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just about studying human capabilities. This was about breaking them down, understanding their limits, so they could be defeated more efficiently. He was looking at a weapon designed specifically to destroy human resistance. The Empress gestured toward the nearest treadmill, a machine that looked like it could probably achieve speeds that would liquefy a human being. "Shall we begin with something simple? I'm curious to see how long you can maintain a running pace before your cardiovascular system fails." Jake walked slowly toward the machine, his mind racing. He needed to buy time, needed to find a way to turn this situation to his advantage. The Empress wanted to understand human endurance? Fine. He'd give her an education she'd never forget. As he stepped onto the treadmill, Jake made a silent promise to every human prisoner in this facility, to every person back on Earth who was counting on him. He would show this alien queen exactly what human endurance really meant. And maybe if he was very lucky and very careful, he could find a way to use her curiosity against her. The machine hummed to life beneath his feet, and Jake Morrison began to run, not knowing that he was about to embark on the most important marathon of his life, with the fate of his entire species hanging in the balance. The treadmill started slowly, almost mockingly so, at what felt like a casual walking pace. Jake found his rhythm easily, his military training automatically adjusting his breathing and stride to maintain efficiency. Around him, banks of alien monitoring equipment hummed and chirped, recording every heartbeat, every breath, every minute detail of his physiology as he moved. Empress Vextera stood nearby, her attention divided between Jake and the streams of data flowing across multiple displays. Her expression was one of intense concentration, like a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. Other Zephyrians had entered the chamber, tall figures in what appeared to be medical or scientific garments, their movements precise and coordinated as they monitored the various instruments. "Current pace is approximately 4 of your kilometers per hour," the Empress announced, well within normal human ambulatory parameters. Increasing speed. The treadmill accelerated smoothly, and Jake adjusted accordingly. This was still comfortable, maybe a light jogging pace. He could maintain this for hours if necessary. The real question was how far she intended to push this test, and what information she hoped to gain from it. Heart rate 112 beats per minute, one of the Zephyrian scientists reported in their melodic language. Respiratory rate 18 cycles per minute. All readings consistent with mild exertion parameters for this species. "Fascinating," Vextera murmured. "Your cardiovascular system is remarkably efficient for such a primitive design. Most species we've encountered show significant stress indicators at much lower activity levels." Jake didn't respond, focusing instead on his breathing and form. The military had drilled endurance running into him until it became as automatic as walking. The trick wasn't to fight the exertion, but to work with it, finding the sweet spot where effort and efficiency balanced out for maximum sustainability. The speed increased again, bringing him to what felt like a moderate running pace. His breathing deepened, but remained controlled, his stride lengthening to accommodate the faster belt. The monitors around him became more active, displaying increasingly complex data streams that the alien scientists studied with obvious fascination. "We are now approaching what our database indicates should be the maximum sustainable pace for human locomotion," the Empress announced. "Yet your stress indicators remain surprisingly low. Perhaps our intelligence on your species was incomplete. Or perhaps, Jake thought, but didn't say, you've been studying the wrong humans." Military personnel weren't exactly representative of the general population when it came to physical conditioning. He'd been running since basic training, pushing his body through increasingly demanding exercises for years. This was still well within his comfort zone. The pace increased again, and now Jake could feel the beginning of real exertion. His heart rate climbed, his breathing became more pronounced, but he was far from his limits. This was about the speed he'd maintained during a fast training run, challenging but sustainable for significant distances. Heart rate 148 came the report. Respiratory rate 26 cycles per minute. Subject is now operating beyond calculated maximum efficiency parameters, but showing no signs of distress. Vextera moved closer to the treadmill, her compound eyes studying Jake's form with clinical interest. Tell me, Captain Morrison, how do you feel currently? Are you experiencing fatigue, discomfort, the urge to slow your pace, or cease the activity? Jake managed a slight smile despite his controlled breathing. This is a warm-up, Your Majesty. I'm just getting started. The Empress tilted her head in what might have been confusion. Warm-up? You are currently operating at 130% of calculated human maximum sustainable velocity. Your calculations might need some work, Jake replied. Humans don't always operate according to textbook specifications. Increase speed by another 20%, Vextera ordered, and Jake felt the belt beneath his feet accelerate again. Now he was running hard, the kind of pace he'd maintained during a competitive race or combat situation. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, his heart working but not straining. Sweat had started to form on his skin, his body's cooling system kicking in to maintain optimal operating temperature. This was where things got interesting. The alien scientists were clearly excited by the readings they were getting, their musical voices rising in pitch as they called out measurements and observations. Jake caught fragments of their language, enough to understand that they were recording data well outside their expected parameters for human capability. This is impossible, one of them said in accented but understandable English, apparently for the Empress's benefit. The subject's lactate levels should be spiking into dangerous ranges, but they remain stable. Oxygen uptake efficiency is maintaining at levels we've never observed in any tested species. Continue, Vextera commanded, her voice taking on an edge of excitement. I want to see exactly where the breaking point occurs. The treadmill sped up again, and Jake had to adjust his strategy. He was now running at close to his racing pace, the kind of speed he could maintain for maybe 30 minutes in optimal conditions. But this wasn't about maintaining it for 30 minutes. This was about showing these aliens what human determination really looked like. He shifted into what military instructors call the pain cave mindset. Accept the discomfort, don't fight it, but don't let it control the situation either. His breathing became deeper and more controlled, his stride shortening slightly to maintain efficiency at the higher speed. The sweat was flowing freely now, his body working hard to maintain core temperature. Heart rate 172 came the clinical report. Respiratory rate 34 cycles per minute. Subject is now operating at what should be maximum sustainable output, but physiological indicators suggest he could maintain this pace for extended periods. Jake could see the confusion on the aliens' faces. They were expecting him to break down, to show signs of the exhaustion that would validate their theories about human limitations. Instead, he was demonstrating something that apparently didn't exist in their experience: the ability to consciously override biological warning systems through pure mental discipline. The speed increased again, pushing him into territory that was genuinely difficult. This was faster than his usual racing pace, the kind of speed he'd use for a sprint finish or emergency combat maneuver. His muscles were starting to burn with the familiar fire of lactic acid buildup, his lungs working hard to process the oxygen demands his body was making. But this was still manageable. Painful, challenging, requiring focus and determination, but manageable. He'd run harder than this during military training exercises, pushed himself further during combat situations where stopping meant dying. The aliens were studying human endurance, but they were approaching it from a clinical perspective. They didn't understand that humans didn't just endure. They embraced the struggle. This is fascinating beyond my wildest projections, Vextera said, circling the treadmill like a predator studying prey. You are currently running at speeds that should trigger massive system failure, yet you appear to be enjoying the challenge. Jake managed a grin despite his elevated breathing. Pain is just weakness leaving the body, ma'am. Basic human philosophy. Philosophy. The Empress stopped moving, her compound eyes focusing on him with laser intensity. You're treating this as a philosophical exercise rather than a physical ordeal? Everything's a philosophical exercise if you think about it right, Jake replied, settling into a breathing pattern that would let him maintain conversation while running. The question isn't whether this hurts or whether I want to stop. The question is whether I'm going to let those feelings control my actions. The alien scientists were practically vibrating with excitement now, their instruments recording data streams that apparently violated everything they thought they knew about biological limitations. Jake could see them exchanging rapid conversations in their musical language, pointing at displays, and gesturing animatedly. Increase speed again, Vextra ordered, her voice tight with anticipation. The belt accelerated, pushing Jake into territory that was genuinely punishing. He was now running faster than he ever had for more than a few minutes at a time, his body screaming protests that he systematically ignored. This was the kind of pace that separated casual athletes from serious competitors, the speed where mental toughness mattered more than physical conditioning. His breathing became harsh and labored, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to escape. The sweat was pouring off him in streams, his uniform soaked through and clinging uncomfortably to his skin. Every muscle in his legs was burning with the effort of maintaining the punishing pace. But he didn't slow down. Instead, he reached deeper into reserves that most beings probably didn't know they had, accessing that peculiar human ability to function beyond the point where functioning should be possible. Military training had taught him that the mind gave up long before the body actually failed, and that the difference between success and failure often came down to simple refusal to quit. Heart rate 196, someone reported, their voice rising with what sounded like alarm. Respiratory rate 42 cycles per minute. Core temperature rising rapidly. Subject should be experiencing system-wide failure. Yet he continues, Vexteros said softly, almost reverently. The human continues to run at maximum output with no sign of voluntary cessation. How is this possible? Jake was starting to enter that strange mental space that endurance athletes knew well, where conscious thought became secondary to pure determination. The pain was still there, still demanding attention, but it had become background noise to the more important business of simply refusing to stop. His vision narrowed slightly, his world contracting to just the rhythm of his feet on the belt and the steady cycle of breath and heartbeat. Because he managed between breaths, stopping isn't an option. Never has been. Never will be. The Empress moved even closer, her alien features displaying what Jake was starting to recognize as scientific fascination mixed with something that might have been respect. Your species operates on principles that defy logical analysis. Pain should be a limiting factor. Exhaustion should force cessation of activity, yet you simply ignore these constraints. Not ignore, Jake corrected, his voice strained but steady. Accept them. Work with them. Use them as fuel instead of letting them become obstacles. The treadmill sped up again, and Jake felt something shift inside him. He was approaching the edge of what was physically possible, the point where even human stubbornness might not be enough to overcome biological reality. But he wasn't there yet. He still had more to give, more to show these aliens about what humans were really capable of when they refused to surrender. His legs felt like they were on fire, his lungs burning with each breath he dragged into them. His heart was beating so fast it felt like a continuous vibration in his chest. Every nerve ending was screaming at him to stop, to give in, to let exhaustion claim him, and end this torture. Instead, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile, wasn't the kind of expression that suggested he was having fun. It was the grim, predatory smile of a human being who had found his breaking point and decided to break it instead of letting it break him. The smile of someone who had discovered that limits were just suggestions. The alien scientists were in an uproar now, their instruments recording readings that apparently shouldn't exist. Jake could hear them calling out measurements and observations in increasingly excited voices, but the words were starting to lose meaning as his world contracted to the essential elements of movement and determination. Impossible, one of them breathed in English. Lactate levels should have induced complete muscular failure. Oxygen debt should have triggered unconsciousness. Core temperature should have initiated automatic shutdown protocols. Yet the subject continues to operate at maximum efficiency. Vexthara was staring at him with an expression Jake couldn't quite interpret, her compound eyes reflecting something between awe and concern. How long can you maintain this pace, human? What are the actual limits of your species' endurance capabilities? Jake found the breath to answer, though it cost him considerable effort. Only one way to find out, isn't there? The Empress gestured to her scientists, and Jake felt the treadmill accelerate one more time, pushing him beyond anything he'd ever experienced. This was past the red line, past the point where training and conditioning provided any meaningful assistance. This was pure human willpower against the fundamental laws of biology, determination versus reality. And for the first time since the test began, Jake Morrison started to understand exactly what kind of weapon he might be wielding against these aliens who thought they understood exhaustion. The world had become very simple for Jake Morrison. There was the belt moving beneath his feet, there was the rhythm of his breathing, and there was the steady beat of his heart. Everything else faded into background noise as his body operated in a zone that existed beyond normal human parameters. The alien monitoring equipment was screaming alarms now, displays flashing warnings in colors that Jake's peripheral vision registered but couldn't process. The Zephyrian scientists were speaking rapidly in their musical language, voices rising in what sounded like panic or amazement. But Jake was barely aware of any of it. His entire universe had contracted to the simple act of continuing to move forward. Subject has been maintaining maximum output for 47 minutes. Came a report that sounded far away despite the speaker being only a few meters from the treadmill. This duration exceeds our projections by a factor of 12. Physiological readings indicate the subject should have experienced complete system failure 32 minutes ago. Empress Vexthara had moved to stand directly in front of the treadmill, her compound eyes fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that would have been uncomfortable under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Jake was operating in a headspace where discomfort was just another piece of environmental data to be processed and filed away. "Tell me what you're experiencing right now," she commanded, her voice cutting through the fog of endurance that surrounded Jake's consciousness. "Describe the sensations, the thought processes, the mechanisms your mind is using to override your body's distress signals." Jake managed to focus on her face, though it took significant effort to pull his attention away from the simple task of running. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse, but steady, each word carefully timed with his breathing pattern. "Not overriding anything," he said between breaths. "Just choosing which signals to prioritize. Body says stop. Mission says continue. Mission wins. Mission." Vexthara's head tilted in that gesture Jake was learning indicated confusion or intense interest. "What mission?" "You're a prisoner performing a test for scientific purposes. There is no tactical objective, no strategic goal to achieve." Jake's smile was grim and distant, the expression of someone looking at something the observer couldn't see. "Always a mission, always a purpose. Right now, the mission is to show you exactly what you're dealing with when you decide to mess with humans." The Empress gestured sharply to her scientists, and Jake felt the treadmill accelerate again. The speed was now well beyond anything that should have been survivable for a human being, the kind of pace that should have torn muscle from bone and reduced him to a collapsed heap of failed biology. Instead, he adjusted his stride microscopically and continued running as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions. "Cardiac output is exceeding maximum theoretical capacity," one of the scientists reported, his voice tight with disbelief. "Oxygen consumption has surpassed the calculated ceiling for this species by nearly 40%. The subject's metabolic efficiency is operating at levels we've never recorded in any organic life form. Yet no performance-enhancing technology is detected," added another scientist. "No artificial stimulants, no cybernetic augmentation, no external support systems. The subject is accomplishing these feats through biological processes alone." Jake could feel himself entering a state that endurance athletes sometimes called the zone, but that military personnel knew by a different name. The place where mission completion became more important than personal survival. It was a dangerous headspace, one that could lead to permanent damage or death if pushed too far, but it was also where humans accomplished things that outside observers classified as impossible. His legs had moved beyond pain into something approaching numbness, his muscles operating on reserves he didn't know he possessed. His lungs burned with each breath, but they continued to process oxygen with mechanical efficiency. His heart hammered against his ribs like an engine running beyond its design specifications, but it kept beating, kept pumping blood to the systems that needed it most. "This is beyond fascinating," Vexthara said, her voice carrying a note that might have been awe. "Your species appears to possess the ability to consciously access emergency metabolic reserves that most life forms can only tap unconsciously during extreme trauma. How do you do this? What mental techniques allow such override of biological safeguards?" Jake's answer came in fragments, timed with his breathing rhythm. Military training, pain management, mental discipline, refusal to accept limitations as permanent. But the physical cost, one of the scientists protested. The cellular damage from sustained operation at these levels should be catastrophic. How does your species survive such self-destructive behavior? "We heal," Jake said simply. "Damage isn't permanent if you know how to recover properly. Adaptation makes you stronger." Basic human principle. The Empress began pacing alongside the treadmill, matching Jake's speed with her longer stride. This close, he could see details in her alien features that he'd missed before, the subtle patterns in her scales that seemed to shift and change as he watched, the way her compound eyes tracked multiple data streams simultaneously. "You speak of recovery and adaptation," she said. "Elaborate on this concept. How does temporary damage lead to increased capability?" Jake found himself slipping into the teaching mode that military instructors developed, the ability to explain complex concepts even under extreme stress. Human body is designed for adaptation. Stress the system properly, give it time to rebuild, it comes back stronger than before. Muscle fibers repair themselves with increased density. Cardiovascular efficiency improves. Neural pathways optimize for better performance. But this assumes survival of the stress event, Vexthara pointed out. What you're demonstrating now should result in systemic failure and death. How do you calculate the acceptable risk threshold? The question made Jake laugh, though it came out as more of a breathless cough. Don't calculate. Just trust the system to hold together until the job's done. Humans have been doing impossible things since before we had the science to understand why they were impossible. The treadmill's speed increased again, and Jake felt something fundamental shift in his physiological response. He was now operating in territory that existed beyond training, beyond conditioning, beyond anything that normal human capability should encompass. This was the realm where willpower became a physical force, where determination could literally override the basic laws of biology. His vision had tunneled to a narrow band of clarity directly in front of him, peripheral awareness fading as his brain redirected energy to essential functions. The sounds of the alien equipment and voices became distant background noise, less important than the steady rhythm that kept his legs moving and his lungs working. Heart rate has stabilized at 204 beats per minute, came a report that sounded like it was coming from very far away. Respiratory rate holding steady at 46 cycles per minute. Core temperature elevated, but maintaining within survivable parameters. This is physically impossible according to every model we have for organic life function. Jake was starting to understand something that he'd never fully grasped during his military training. The human capacity for endurance wasn't just about physical conditioning or mental toughness. It was about something deeper, something that connected to the basic survival programming that had allowed humans to persist and thrive in environments that should have killed them. His ancestors had walked across continents, chased prey animals for hours until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, survived ice ages and droughts and disasters that wiped out species with more impressive physical capabilities. They'd done it not because they were the strongest or fastest or most efficient, but because they simply refused to give up. "Your species," Vexthara said, her voice penetrating the fog of endurance that surrounded Jake's consciousness, "appears to possess a fundamental misunderstanding of biological limitations. You operate as if the constraints that govern all other life forms simply don't apply to you." "Maybe they don't," Jake managed to say, his voice distant but clear. Maybe the mistake is assuming the constraints are absolute instead of just problems waiting to be solved. The Empress stopped pacing and stared at him with those multifaceted eyes. You're suggesting that humans consciously reject the concept of unchangeable limitations. I'm suggesting, Jake said between measured breaths, that humans figured out a long time ago that the only real limitation is deciding to accept limitations. Everything else is just engineering problems. One of the scientists called out something urgent in a Zephyrian language, pointing at a display that was flashing increasingly frantic warning colors. Vexthera glanced at it, and her expression shifted to something that might have been alarm. Subject's cellular metabolic rate has exceeded safe parameters by unprecedented margins, the scientist reported in English. Continued operation at these levels will result in permanent physiological damage within minutes. We must terminate the test immediately. No, Jake said firmly, his voice cutting through the alien chatter with surprising strength. Not your decision to make. The Empress looked between Jake and the warning displays, clearly torn between scientific curiosity and what might have been genuine concern for his welfare. Captain Morrison, my medical staff believes you are approaching the point of irreversible harm. Surely your mission parameters don't require you to destroy yourself in a testing facility. Jake's smile was grim and determined, the expression of someone who had found the bottom of his reserves and discovered there was still more beneath. My mission parameters require me to show you exactly what humans are capable of when you threaten our people. This is just getting interesting. He could feel his body operating in a state that existed beyond normal biological function, running on reserves that shouldn't have existed and accessing capabilities that violated every model of human performance. His heart was beating so fast it felt like a continuous vibration, his lungs processing oxygen with impossible efficiency, his muscles drawing energy from sources his conscious mind couldn't identify. This was the place where human determination became something approaching supernatural, where the species that had crawled out of caves and eventually reached for the stars demonstrated exactly why they'd survived everything the universe had thrown at them. Increase the speed again, Jake said clearly, his voice carrying across the testing chamber with unmistakable authority. The Empress stared at him for a long moment, her compound eyes reflecting something between admiration and horror. Then, she gestured to her technicians, and Jake felt the belt beneath his feet accelerate once more, carrying him in a territory that existed beyond the boundaries of what any living being should be able to endure. As the treadmill pushed him toward what should have been certain death, Jake Morrison smiled a predatory smile of a human being who had just found the weapon he needed to save his species. The aliens thought they understood endurance, but they were about to learn the difference between lasting a long time and absolutely refusing to quit. The moment Jake Morrison collapsed, the testing chamber erupted into controlled chaos. Alien medical personnel swarmed the treadmill as it automatically decelerated, their movements precise and efficient as they began emergency treatment procedures. Empress Vexthera stood motionless nearby, her compound eyes fixed on Jake's unconscious form with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Cardiac arrest, one of the medical technicians reported tersely, initiating resuscitation protocols. Jake felt consciousness return like waves washing over a distant shore, awareness coming in fragments that slowly assembled into coherence. The first thing he noticed was that he wasn't dead, which was something of a surprise given what he remembered of the final moments on the treadmill. The second thing he noticed was that he felt remarkably good for someone who had just pushed his body beyond the theoretical limits of human endurance. Fascinating, Vexthera said as Jake's eyes opened. Full consciousness restored within 4 minutes and 17 seconds of cardiovascular failure. Recovery rate exceeding all projections for this species. Jake sat up slowly on the medical platform where they'd placed him, taking inventory of his physical condition. His legs felt shaky but functional, his breathing was steady and deep, and his heart rate felt normal. By all rights, he should have been destroyed by what he'd just put his body through, but instead he felt like he'd just completed a challenging but manageable workout. "How do you feel, Captain Morrison?" the Empress asked, moving closer to study his responses. "Like I need to stretch and hydrate," Jake replied honestly. "And Maybe get some food. Running always makes me hungry. The alien medical staff exchanged rapid communications in their musical language, clearly agitated by his responses. One of them approached with a scanning device that hummed and clicked as it passed over Jake's body, projecting displays that showed what appeared to be detailed physiological data. Remarkable, the technician reported in accented English. Cellular damage is minimal. Lactate levels already returning to baseline parameters. Cardiovascular function showing no signs of lasting stress. It's as if the subject's biology is specifically designed for rapid recovery from extreme exertion. Vextera circled the medical platform, her movements showing the same predatory grace Jake had noticed during their first encounter. But now there was something else in her manner, a quality that might have been uncertainty or even concern. You maintained maximum output for 1 hour and 23 minutes, she said. Speeds and duration that should have resulted in catastrophic system failure. Yet you recovered completely within minutes of cessation. This challenges everything we know about biological limitations. Jake swung his legs off the platform and stood, pleased to find that his balance was steady. Maybe your knowledge of biological limitations is incomplete. Humans have been surprising people for a long time. Indeed, the Empress murmured. Which brings me to the next phase of testing. If your species can transcend normal endurance parameters through sheer determination, I'm curious to see how you respond to more complex challenges. She led Jake from the medical area to another section of the testing facility, this one filled with equipment that looked more psychological than physical. Virtual reality interfaces, sensory deprivation chambers, and devices whose purpose Jake could only guess at lined the walls in precise rows. Your performance on the endurance test suggests that human capabilities extend beyond physical parameters, Vextera explained as they walked. I hypothesize that your species has developed mental techniques that allow conscious override of normally unconscious biological processes. I intend to test this theory. Jake was escorted to a chair that looked more like a command station than testing equipment, surrounded by displays and interfaces that activated as he approached. The Empress gestured for him to sit, which he did with some reluctance, remembering how the last testing session had concluded. This evaluation will measure cognitive function under extreme stress conditions, she explained, activating various controls around the chair. Sensory overload, sleep deprivation, pain stimulus, and psychological pressure applied simultaneously while you attempt to solve increasingly complex problems. The chair hummed to life around Jake, and he felt various sensors making contact with his skin. The displays around him began showing data streams that tracked everything from brain activity to stress hormone levels. It was sophisticated equipment, clearly designed by beings who understood the relationship between mental and physical performance. The test will continue until you experience complete cognitive breakdown, Vextera continued matter-of-factly. Previous subjects from other species typically reach failure within the first hour. I'm curious to see how human mental resilience compares to human physical endurance. Jake settled into the chair and looked directly at the Empress. You might want to schedule some extra time for this one. The test began subtly. A low-frequency sound that was just barely perceptible, visual patterns on the displays that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them, slight variations in temperature, and air pressure that created a sense of disorientation. Combined with it were mental puzzles, mathematical problems, and logic challenges that appeared on the main display. At first, it was merely annoying. Jake had been through psychological stress training during his military service, exposure to sensory manipulation, and mental pressure designed to prepare personnel for interrogation and torture scenarios. The alien version was more sophisticated, but the basic principles were the same. Overwhelm the subject's ability to process information and maintain focus. As the session progressed, the stressors became more intense. The sounds shifted to frequencies that made his teeth ache. The visual patterns became aggressive enough to trigger motion sickness, and the chair began introducing mild electric shocks at random intervals. Meanwhile, the mental problems became increasingly complex, requiring sustained concentration to solve. Interesting, Vextera observed, studying the readouts. 47 minutes elapsed. Most species show significant cognitive degradation by this point, but your performance remains steady. Brain activity indicates you're processing the stress as environmental data rather than allowing it to interfere with problem-solving functions. Jake was finding his rhythm in the mental challenges, the same way he'd found his rhythm on the treadmill. Accept the discomfort, file it away as irrelevant to the task at hand, and focus on what needed to be accomplished. The military had taught him to compartmentalize, to separate what he could control from what he couldn't. Military training again, he said, solving another complex equation despite the increasing sensory assault. Stress inoculation. Controlled exposure to gradually increasing pressure until your tolerance expands to accommodate higher levels. But this assumes the existence of upper limits, the Empress pointed out. Every species we've tested has reached a breaking point where cognitive function collapses completely. What makes you believe humans are different? Jake paused in his problem-solving to consider the question seriously. Because we've always had to be different. Humans aren't the strongest, fastest, or smartest species on our home world. We survive because we learn to adapt, to push beyond what should be possible. It's not about being special. It's about being too stubborn to accept defeat. The stress testing intensified dramatically. The sounds became painful. The lights strobed in patterns designed to induce seizures. The chair delivered shocks that were genuinely painful rather than merely annoying. At the same time, the mental challenges became fiendishly complex, requiring him to maintain multiple streams of analysis simultaneously while processing sensory input that was actively trying to disrupt his concentration. Jake found himself entering a state similar to what he'd experienced on the treadmill, where the external pressures became background noise to the more important business of completing the assigned tasks. It was a form of focused tunnel vision, where consciousness contracted to just the essential elements needed to function. 1 hour and 34 minutes came a report from the monitoring staff. Subject maintaining 92% accuracy on cognitive challenges despite stress levels that should have induced complete mental breakdown. This is unprecedented in our testing protocols. Vextera had moved to stand directly in front of Jake's chair, her compound eyes reflecting the strobing lights in complex patterns. Describe your current mental state, Captain. What techniques are you using to maintain focus under these conditions? Jake's voice was steady despite the assault on his senses. Same as always. Prioritize what matters. File away what doesn't. The pain and confusion are just noise. The problems that need solving are signal. Focus on the signal. Ignore the noise. But the physiological stress indicators are extreme, one of the scientists protested. Cortisol levels, neural firing patterns, sensory processing load, all indicate the subject should be experiencing acute psychological distress. I am, Jake confirmed, completing another complex puzzle while the chair delivered a particularly vicious shock. But distress doesn't prevent function if you don't let it. Military personnel operate under extreme stress as a matter of routine. Combat, life-or-death decisions, chaos, and confusion and fear. You learn to do the job regardless of how you feel about it. The Empress gestured to her technicians, and the testing intensity increased again. Jake felt his concentration waver for the first time as the sensory overload reached levels that were genuinely difficult to process. But instead of breaking down, he adjusted his mental approach, compartmentalizing even more ruthlessly and focusing on smaller, more manageable pieces of each challenge. 2 hours and 11 minutes came another report. Subject accuracy has dropped to 87%, but remains stable. Stress tolerance continues to exceed all known parameters for organic cognitive function. Jake was starting to understand something important about the testing he was undergoing. The aliens weren't just studying human endurance. They were trying to find the breaking point where humans stopped being effective. They needed to know how much pressure it took to make humans give up, because their entire strategy of conquest depended on outlasting their enemies through superior staying power. But they were operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about human nature. They assumed that every species had a breaking point, a level of stress and suffering that would cause them to surrender. They'd built their empire on this assumption, and it had worked for every species they'd encountered so far. They didn't understand that humans had evolved in an environment where surrender meant extinction, where the ability to keep going despite overwhelming odds was literally the difference between species survival and evolutionary dead end. They didn't understand that humans had turned stubbornness into an art form. "Tell me about human military doctrine," Vexthera said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sensory chaos surrounding Jake's chair. "How do your forces maintain combat effectiveness under sustained pressure?" Jake smiled grimly as he worked through another complex problem, his mind automatically organizing the solution into logical steps despite the strobing lights and painful sounds. "Basic principle. When you can't retreat and you can't surrender, the only option left is to win. Everything else is just details. But surely there are limits to what even human determination can accomplish," the Empress pressed. "Physical laws, resource constraints, technological disparities. How do you overcome impossible odds?" "Same way we always have," Jake replied, his accuracy rate climbing back toward previous levels as he adapted to the new stress parameters. "We refuse to accept that the odds are impossible. We find ways to make the impossible work anyway." The testing continued for another hour, the alien equipment pushing him toward psychological breaking points that should have shattered his ability to think coherently. Instead, Jake found himself settling into a state of calm focus that was eerily similar to what he'd experienced during the physical endurance test. The chaos became background noise, the pain became irrelevant data, and the complex mental challenges became simply problems that needed solving. When Vexthera, finally, ordered the test terminated, Jake had maintained cognitive function for 3 hours and 47 minutes under stress conditions that had been designed to break trained soldiers within minutes. As the sensory assault ceased and the equipment powered down, he sat quietly in the chair, waiting for his senses to readjust to normal environmental conditions. "Impossible," one of the alien scientists was saying. "Complete cognitive breakdown should have occurred within the first 30 minutes. The subject maintained problem-solving capability throughout the entire session, despite stress loads that exceed maximum tolerance for any known species." The Empress stood quietly for a long moment, studying the data displays that showed Jake's performance metrics. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note that Jake hadn't heard before, something that might have been respect or concern. "Your species," she said slowly, "may represent a fundamental challenge to our understanding of biological limitations. If humans can maintain function indefinitely under conditions that break other species, our standard conquest methodology may be insufficient." Jake met her gaze steadily. "That's what I've been trying to tell you, Your Majesty. You picked the wrong species to mess with." The revelation came during what Empress Vexthera called the final evaluation, though Jake suspected it was less about testing human capabilities and more about the Empress coming to terms with what those capabilities meant for her empire. She'd moved their sessions from the testing facility to what appeared to be her private study, a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing star charts, military deployments, and what looked like conquest timelines for dozens of worlds. "Observe," she said, activating a three-dimensional map of the galaxy that filled the center of the room. The Zephyrian Empire built over 7 centuries of systematic expansion, each world conquered through our species' superior endurance and persistence. Jake studied the display, noting the meticulous organization and tactical precision that had gone into building this stellar empire. Red indicators showed conquered worlds, yellow showed current military operations, and a small cluster of blue indicated what he assumed was human space. "Our methodology is elegant in its simplicity," Vexthera continued, manipulating the display to show tactical analyses of various campaigns. "We identify target civilizations, deploy overwhelming force, and maintain constant pressure until their resistance collapses from exhaustion. Most species capitulate within months. The longest resistance we've encountered lasted 18 standard months." She highlighted a section of the map showing a spiral arm where human colonies were scattered like tiny islands in an ocean of red. "Your species has been resisting our advance for 4 years and 7 months. Not only have you failed to collapse, you've actually increased the intensity of your resistance over time." Jake felt a surge of pride mixed with grim satisfaction. Humanity might be outgunned and outnumbered, but they were doing what humans did best: adapting, persisting, and refusing to accept defeat as inevitable. "Initially, we attributed this to superior technology or hidden resources," the Empress continued. Our intelligence suggested that humans possessed some form of advanced military capability that wasn't apparent during first contact. These tests have revealed the truth. She turned to face Jake directly, her compound eyes reflecting the shifting colors of the holographic displays. Your species possesses no secret weapons, no hidden advantages beyond what we observed initially. You're resisting our empire through sheer biological determination to continue fighting despite overwhelming odds. Jake nodded slowly. That sounds about right. Humans have a lot of experience being outmatched by superior forces. We've gotten pretty good at winning anyway. But this creates a strategic problem that we've never encountered, Vexteros said, her voice taking on a tone that Jake was learning indicated serious concern. Our entire military doctrine depends on enemy exhaustion and collapse. If humans simply refuse to become exhausted, our advantages become irrelevant. She manipulated the star map again, showing projected timelines and resource allocations. Continued warfare with your species will require indefinite deployment of our forces with no guarantee of victory. The economic cost alone would destabilize our empire, and the psychological impact on our military personnel could prove catastrophic. Jake began to understand what she was really saying. The Zephyrians had built their empire on the assumption that persistence and endurance were their unique advantages. They'd never encountered a species that could match them in these areas, much less exceed them. Humans weren't just resisting conquest, they were making conquest economically and strategically impossible. You're saying that fighting humans indefinitely would destroy your empire from within, Jake observed. Precisely, Vextera confirmed. Our entire civilization is structured around the principle of efficient conquest through superior stamina. Your species violates that principle completely. Humans appear to become more determined as conflicts continue, not less. She activated another display showing detailed analysis of human military performance over the course of the war. Jake could see the trend lines clearly. Human effectiveness increasing over time, adaptation rates accelerating, combat innovations appearing at an exponential pace. Look at this data, the Empress said, highlighting specific sections. Your force's combat effectiveness has increased by 47% over the course of the conflict. Your technology adaptation rate has tripled. Your strategic coordination has evolved from primitive to sophisticated in a time frame that should be impossible for any species. Jake smiled grimly. Humans learn fast when the alternative is extinction. Pressure makes us better, not worse. Which brings me to the purpose of this conversation, Vexteros said, deactivating the displays and moving to stand directly in front of Jake. I find myself in a position I've never faced before. For the first time in my reign, I'm considering the possibility of negotiation rather than conquest. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Jake felt his pulse quicken as he began to understand the implications of what the Empress was suggesting. This wasn't just about studying human endurance anymore. This was about the future of the war itself. What kind of negotiation? He asked carefully. A strategic accommodation, she replied. Recognition of human territorial claims in exchange for cessation of hostilities. Your species maintains control of your current worlds. We maintain control of ours. And both civilizations avoid the mutual destruction that continued warfare would inevitably produce. Jake considered the offer, weighing the implications. It would save countless human lives and preserve Earth's independence, but it would also leave the Zephyrian Empire free to continue conquering other species. Was human survival worth the sacrifice of potential future victims? What about the other species in your empire? He asked. The ones you've already conquered? Vextera's expression was unreadable. They lacked the biological determination necessary for successful resistance. Their integration into our empire is complete and irreversible. Unless they learned from human example, Jake pointed out. Unless they discovered that the real difference isn't biology, but attitude. Humans aren't naturally more stubborn than anyone else. We just learned to be stubborn because the alternative was dying out. The Empress was quiet for a long moment, her compound eyes reflecting something that might have been concern. You're suggesting that human resistance techniques could be taught to other species? I'm suggesting that your empire might have a bigger problem than you think, Jake replied. Once word gets out that the Zephyrians can be successfully resisted, that they're not invincible after all, other species might start getting ideas about independence. Vextera began pacing, her movements showing agitation for the first time since Jake had met her. This is precisely why a negotiated settlement is preferable to continued conflict. A formal peace treaty would prevent such destabilizing influences from spreading throughout our territory. Jake stood up from his chair, testing whether the Empress would object to him moving freely. When she didn't react, he walked to the star map display and studied the distribution of conquered worlds, looking for patterns and strategic relationships. "There's another option," he said quietly. "Which is?" Jake turned to face her, his expression serious. "You could stop conquering people. Your empire is already vast enough to provide everything your species could possibly need. You could transition from expansion to consolidation, focus on improving the lives of the beings you already control, rather than adding more victims to your collection." The Empress stared at him as if he'd just suggested something utterly incomprehensible. "Cease expansion?" But expansion is the fundamental principle of Zephyrian civilization. It's what defines us as a species. So did conquest for a lot of human civilizations, Jake pointed out. We eventually learned that cooperation and mutual benefit were more sustainable than domination and exploitation. It's called social evolution. Your species abandoned conquest because you lacked the capability to maintain it, Vextera countered. We possess superior endurance and technological capability. Why would we voluntarily limit our natural advantages? Jake smiled, the same grim expression he'd worn during the endurance tests. Because your natural advantages just stopped working. Humans have proven that determination and adaptability can overcome superior technology and endurance. If we can do it, other species can learn to do it too. Your empire is about to face an epidemic of successful resistance. The implications of his words were clearly settling in on the Empress. Her pacing became more agitated, her movements showing stress patterns that Jake hadn't seen before. The possibility that human resistance could inspire galaxy-wide rebellion was apparently more terrifying to her than the prospect of indefinite warfare. "There is a third alternative," she said suddenly, stopping her pacing and fixing Jake with those unsettling compound eyes. "Which is?" "Incorporation," Vextera said simply. "Rather than fighting humans or negotiating with them, we could offer them partnership. Human determination combined with Zephyrian technology and resources could create an unstoppable force for galactic expansion." Jake felt his stomach drop as he realized what she was suggesting. "You want humans to help you conquer other species?" "I want to prevent the collapse of galactic civilization," she replied. "If human resistance techniques spread throughout our territory, the result will be chaos, warfare, and the destruction of the infrastructure that maintains peaceful existence for trillions of beings. A human-Zephyrian alliance could prevent such catastrophe." It was a sophisticated trap, Jake realized. Offer humans a position of power within the Empire in exchange for helping to maintain that Empire's stability. Frame it as preventing greater suffering while actually perpetuating the system that created the suffering in the first place. "That's not going to work," he said firmly. "Why not?" "Humans would gain access to technology and resources beyond your current capabilities. Your species would become partners rather than enemies. The arrangement benefits everyone involved." Jake shook his head. "Because the fundamental problem isn't who's in charge of the Empire. It's the fact that the Empire exists at all. Humans don't fight because we enjoy warfare. We fight because we believe in the right of species to determine their own destinies." He gestured toward the star map with its countless red indicators. Every one of those conquered worlds represents billions of beings who had their freedom taken away by force. Humans can't be part of maintaining that system, regardless of what benefits we might receive. The Empress studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "So you would condemn your species to inevitable destruction rather than accept a practical solution?" "I would trust my species to find a fourth alternative that you haven't considered," Jake replied. "One where nobody has to be conquered or enslaved or forced to live under alien rule. It might take longer, it might be more difficult, but humans have a lot of experience with impossible situations." Vextera moved to the star map and stared at it for a long time, her compound eyes tracking the complex patterns of her empire. Your species truly believes that all these worlds could coexist peacefully without central authority? Our species believe that trying to force peace through conquest is like trying to create happiness through torture, Jake said. It contradicts its own purpose. Real peace comes from mutual respect and voluntary cooperation. The Empress was quiet for another long moment. Then she activated a communication device and spoke rapidly in the Zephyrian language. Jake couldn't understand the words, but the tone suggested she was issuing orders of considerable importance. "I'm ordering the release of all human prisoners," she announced, switching back to English. "You will be provided with transportation back to your lines. Consider this a gesture of good faith while I evaluate the alternatives you've presented." Jake felt relief wash over him, but it was mixed with concern. "What happens to the war while you're evaluating?" "Cessation of offensive operations against human territories," Vextera replied. "Temporary withdrawal of our forces to defensive positions. Your species will have time to demonstrate whether human ideals can produce practical alternatives to conquest." She moved closer to Jake, her expression intense. "But understand this, Captain Morrison. If your fourth alternative proves to be nothing more than naive optimism, if galactic civilization begins to collapse into chaos and warfare, I will resume expansion with every resource at my disposal. The peace will end, and this time there will be no prisoners taken." Jake met her gaze steadily. "Understood, Your Majesty. But I think you're going to be surprised by what humans can accomplish when we're not busy fighting for our survival." As he was escorted from the Empress's chambers toward what he hoped was freedom, Jake Morrison allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic for the first time since his capture. Humans had just won the most important victory in their species' history, not through superior firepower or technology, but through the simple refusal to accept defeat as inevitable. Now came the hard part, proving that human idealism could work on a galactic scale. But if there was one thing Jake had learned during his time in Zephyrian custody, it was that humans had a remarkable talent for turning impossible challenges into achievable goals. The real test was just beginning.